The falcon came back covered in blood. In its talons, her father's royal seal, long believed buried with his bones. But the grave was empty. And someone had opened the castle gates from the inside. Now every man she trusted is hunting her down. She has one chance. One blade. One secret no one dares to speak aloud. And if she fails, the kingdom won't just fall, it will forget her name forever. Because the real traitor wears a crown. But before we begin, write in the comments where you're from. I'm curious to see how far these stories can travel. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new captivating tales. Let's begin. They called it Caerwyn Keep, but time had other names for it: Stone Bones, Widow's Roost, the last quiet place before war. The old men who kept watch from its battlements never spoke above a whisper after sundown, not from superstition, but out of a fear carved into them by things they refused to name. A castle could carry curses, just as a man could carry sin, and both could wear the face of a father. Lady Elenora had known since childhood that she was not meant to sit still, smile politely, and stitch daisies into silk pillows while the men of the court decided which cage would suit her future best. She learned early how to hold her tongue in council and how to poison a rumor in court just enough to watch it rot from within. But falconry, that had been her first rebellion, and perhaps her only true love before everything else fell to dust. Ashwing had been just a fledgling when she rescued him from the thornwood, his wing broken, his eyes blazing with fury and terror. No man in the duchy could calm him, but the bird took to Elenora like a soul already known. They healed each other, inch by inch, wound by wound, a girl with no voice of her own and a falcon who answered only to her call. That winter, her father changed. The once proud Duke of Caerwyn, who'd ruled with iron fairness, began to speak to empty rooms and burn letters in secret. He met with Lord Harwin Morecrest behind locked doors and began whispering about alliances forged in blood, not ink. One morning, the Duke summoned Elenora to the garden where her mother used to walk before the fever took her, and there, beneath the twisted yew, he sealed her fate with 12 words: "You will marry Lord Harwin before the snow breaks." It is done. No plea softened him. No logic swayed him. His hands trembled when he said it, not with rage, but with guilt so heavy it bent his back. And then, before she could run, rebel, or reason, he vanished. Not dead. Not slain. Just gone. They found the gates wide open, the guards drugged or dead asleep, and no sign of a struggle. His ring, his seal, had been taken. The chamberlain said it was theft. The bishop said it was divine judgment. Elenora said nothing, but her heart howled like a beast cornered in winter. 2 days later, Morecrest arrived. He walked with the confidence of a man who already considered her his. A wide grin, thin eyes, and a voice so sweet it stank. He claimed the Duke had ridden out on pilgrimage and left him in charge. The papers were signed. The wedding would be held within a fortnight. The people bowed. The guards obeyed. And Elenora disappeared. She left that same night, wearing the robes of a falconer's apprentice, a boy's name on her lips, and Ashwing strapped to her shoulder beneath a weather-beaten cloak. She didn't look back. Not once. Out past the frozen rivers, beyond the forests where the wolves ran silent and the crows spoke secrets to those who listened, lay the borderlands. Half claimed, half burned, all forgotten. War had gutted these places, not with fire and arrows, but with silence and neglect. The crown didn't come here anymore. Only ghosts and outlaws kept vigil now. There, she found the camp. It was buried in the ruins of a chapel long abandoned, the walls overgrown with ivy, the altar turned into a forge. Smoke curled up from hidden chimneys. Men with scars and missing limbs watched from the shadows, but did not challenge her when she asked for shelter. Only one man stepped forward, tall, quiet, and hard-eyed like a hawk that had seen too many winters. Sir Rhys of Elderholt. She knew the name, of course. All noble daughters were taught the names of men who rose too high and fell too hard. Rhys had once stood beside the king, before his oath was broken. No one knew why, only that his disgrace had been swift and his exile final. Now, he was just a ghost with a sword, surrounded by misfits who called him lord out of habit, not title. He let her stay. On one condition. She would work. No titles. No names. No questions. Elenora agreed. She scrubbed, carried, mended, and taught. What began as survival slowly became something else. The children trusted her. The wounded sought her herbs. And Reese began to watch her more closely. It started when she trained Ashwing outside the old bell tower. He recognized the bird, rare, noble, trained for war. He said nothing, but his silence grew sharper, like a knife being honed on suspicion. Then came the bounty. It arrived on the back of a deserter, shaking and bloodied, who dropped the parchment before collapsing by the fire. A royal seal. A reward too high for any common girl. And a sketch. Elenora's face. It was rough, rushed, but clear enough to betray her to anyone with eyes. She knew then the hunt had begun. Morecrest wasn't satisfied with a throne. He wanted revenge. Reese said nothing for a long time after reading it. Then he looked at her, really looked, and asked, in a voice more tired than angry, "Who the hell are you?" But before she could answer, Ashwing screamed. Not a call for food. A warning. From the hills above, flames bloomed like flowers. The camp had been found. And someone had sold them out. It started with the smell, the heavy, unmistakable scent of pitch and burning straw, creeping into the lungs like the first lie of war. The kind of smoke that doesn't rise from a hearth or a cook fire but from something older, meaner, and soaked in purpose. Elenora had barely turned her head toward the hills when the night burst open with flame, and the sound of horses, fast, unmerciful, and coming straight for the heart of the ruin. Sir Reese didn't shout. He didn't need to. With one quick motion, he pointed toward the children and the narrow path leading into the gorge below, and every man and woman in that camp moved like muscle around a wounded heart. These were not green soldiers or startled peasants. These were people who had lived through betrayal, who had seen castles fall and watched good men hanged for the sins of their lords. They didn't run from fire. They moved through it. Elenora's feet had barely touched the chapel stones before she grabbed the falcon's hood and freed Ashwing into the sky. He climbed like a prayer with wings, circling once before vanishing into the smoke. If anyone had doubted her before, they didn't now. No apprentice kept a falcon like that. Not in these parts. Not in times like these. Reese stayed behind with 10 men and a sword that had once been knighted by the king himself. The blade had seen better years, chipped at the hilt, darkened by age, but in his hand it still had the kind of truth that steel remembers when forged in war and carried in exile. Elenora wanted to fight beside him, but he stopped her with a glance that froze her steps better than a shout ever could. "There'll be time for valor if we live through tonight," he said, voice low, rough as gravel soaked in whiskey. "Now go. You're the reason they burn." She didn't argue. That was the moment she realized, for the first time, truly, that her escape had not only endangered herself. It had put 100 souls between her freedom and a tyrant's pride. And that kind of burden doesn't vanish just because you change your name. She followed the children through the gorge path, winding beneath blackened trees and wet stone, her boots slipping in the ash that fell like snow. Around her, the young clutched their blankets and the old carried what they could, rusted tools, worn maps, the bones of kin buried too long in ground that no longer held them. There's something different about fear when it rides in silence like that. No screams. No panic. Just the long, slow throb of survival, beat after steady beat. Behind them, the chapel bell rang once. Just once. And then it cracked. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried. It was the kind of sound that marked an ending. A death. A promise undone. They found a cave at dawn, tucked beneath a shelf of limestone that Rhys had once used during a siege long ago, back when he still believed in kings and crowns. Sister Breda was already there, having arrived through another route with herbs and firewood and 2 orphan girls clinging to her skirt like shadows. She did not ask questions. She never did. Breda had once been a midwife, then a healer, then a fugitive. She knew that names were less important than wounds, and tonight, the camp carried both. Elenora sat in the corner, trembling not from cold, but from memory. The flames still danced behind her eyes, and the guilt pressed harder than any hunger or pain. Ashwing had not returned. She prayed he hadn't been caught by fire or arrow, but there are no promises in a war that doesn't wear uniforms. Rhys arrived before dusk, walking alone. His sword was broken at the base. His cloak was singed. Blood crusted on his jaw. But his eyes, those eyes still held the fire. "We held," he said simply, and sat down without another word. That night, Breda stitched the cuts on his shoulder by firelight while the children watched without speaking. And somewhere in the dark, an old man began to hum a tune from the coastlands, the kind of song once sung by fishermen before they sailed into storms and left their names behind. Rhys didn't ask again who she was. He didn't need to. Instead, he told her what he knew. Morecrest had put a bounty not just on her head, but on any who aided her. The new royal decree declared her a traitor, a conspirator in her father's supposed death, and a heretic for practicing the forbidden art of falconry, a superstition twisted by the church into something unnatural. The priests had claimed Ashwing was no mere bird but a spirit familiar, a symbol of witchery, and a sign that the house of Cerwyn had fallen from divine favor. It was nonsense, of course. But it was the kind of nonsense that could burn villages. Then he handed her something wrapped in oilcloth. Her father's ring. The same one Ashwing had returned with. She stared at it for a long time before speaking. "Where did you find this?" Rhys answered, not with words, but with a name. General Malric. The name hit like cold steel. General Malric had been the king's hammer, a war hero, now turned enforcer, a man with more graves behind him than memories. He had ridden through the chapel ruins that morning with Morecrest's standard and burned everything he could not carry. But he had dropped the ring. Whether by accident or design, Rhys did not know. But Elenora did. Her father had not run. He had been taken. And if Malric had his ring, then Morecrest had lied. Again. The next morning, Elenora stood at the edge of the cave, eyes fixed on the eastern mountains where Cerwyn Keep still stood like a tooth in a rotting mouth. She was tired. Older than her years. But there was something in her now that had not been there before. Resolve. Rhys came to her side. "If you go back," he said, "you might not come out again." "I know," she replied. "But I can't stay hidden while he burns my name into ashes." Then she turned to him, and what passed between them wasn't love, not yet. It was something stronger. Older. A promise between two people who had lost everything but still chose to stand. Behind them, Ashwing returned, scorched, furious, but alive. And tied to his leg, was a scrap of parchment bearing a crest no one had seen in 30 years. The sigil of the Flameborn, an ancient order thought long dead. Elenora took the message, heart-pounding. She knew then the war was not just for her name, or her father's ring, or a crown she never asked for. It was for the truth. And somewhere, someone still alive knew it. The parchment crinkled in her fingers like old leaves pressed between the pages of a forgotten Bible, the kind tucked away in drawers where widows keep their memories and guilt. It was brittle, ink faded, yet the sigil burned clear, a silver flame rising from a broken sword. The mark of the Flameborn, whispered about in old soldiers' taverns and battlefield hymns, always half-truth, half-ghost. They were said to be dead, hunted down by kings who feared loyalty that didn't answer to gold or God. But there it was, drawn by a steady hand, sealed with wax so black it looked like dried blood. Rhys held the message to the light, squinting with that quiet squint he used when something reminded him of the man he used to be. The fire flickered across his jaw, tracing the hard lines of a life carved by discipline, betrayal, and something deeper, the ache of a warrior who lived past his purpose but hadn't yet found a grave worth dying for. They were real, he muttered, not asking. Stating. They were ours once. Before the king outlawed them. Elenora didn't speak. She already knew. Her father had once told her bedtime stories of the Flameborn, how they stood watch along the mountain passes, refusing bribes, swearing fealty not to the crown but to the kingdom itself. They were knights of the old code, the last to kneel and the first to bleed. And they had vanished like smoke after a winter war that no historian ever wrote down. The message was brief, 4 words scratched in haste. Cerwyn hides the flame. 4 words that held enough weight to bend her knees. She rose before dawn with the parchment wrapped tight in leather and tucked it beneath her bodice, close to the heart that beat faster than she cared to admit. Her voice was steady, but inside her mind ran like a frightened horse, hooves pounding, thoughts kicking at walls that had stood for years. Rhys came with her. He didn't offer speeches, warnings, or promises. Men like him didn't believe in assurances, only action. His blade was sharpened, though broken. His armor was piecemeal, but worn with pride. And on his face, the same quiet fire that had once earned him a banner under the king's personal guard. Sister Brita stayed behind with the others, armed with poultices, patience, and a mouth full of scripture that had never seen the inside of a cathedral. She kissed Elenora's brow and pressed a vial into her hand, a sleeping draught laced with nightshade, strong enough to drop a man twice her size. Not all fights are won with steel, she whispered. Sometimes you have to let the devil sleep before you cut his throat. They rode northeast, cloaks drawn tight, into the part of the kingdom the maps left blank, hills where lightning struck in silence, and travelers told stories of vanished caravans and forests that moved when no wind blew. Rhys called it the Weeping Reach, though no tears had fallen there in years. Just bones, brambles, and secrets left too long in the dark. Ashwing scouted high above, his cry sharper now, less of a call and more of a warning to anything with eyes. Elenora trusted the bird more than most people she had ever known. Animals, after all, had no use for lies. 3 days into the journey, they found the ruin. It was barely a chapel now, only 4 walls, half a roof, and a bell that had long since rusted into silence. But beneath the altar stone, hidden beneath layers of earth and ivy, they found a hatch. Rhys looked to her, not as a knight to a noblewoman, but as a man to an equal. No one goes back after this, he said. Only forward. That's the old oath. She answered not with words, but by opening the hatch. The stairs led down into darkness, carved stone slick with time and damp. They descended for what felt like hours, torches casting shadows that danced like old regrets. At the bottom, they found them. 6 of them. Still alive. Dressed in cloaks of deep gray, swords etched with the flame. Faces weathered, hands scarred, eyes sharp. These were not men waiting to be found. These were men who had chosen to disappear, to wait, to endure, to become myth so they might one day strike as truth. The eldest stepped forward. Daughter of Cerwyn, he said. The flame remembers you. She dropped to one knee, not out of tradition, but respect. The man's voice carried the weight of decades, like someone who had buried friends and carried their sins so long he'd forgotten where his own ended and theirs began. We thought you were gone, he continued. When your father fell, we believed the line was broken. But the bird found us. And now, we rise. Rhys stepped forward, his presence drawing a murmur from the shadows. Sir Rhys of Elderholt, one said. They said you died at the River Pyre. Not dead, Rhys answered. Just tired. They smiled at that, warriors recognizing one of their own. Old soldiers didn't fear death. They feared silence. Forgotten legacies. Betrayals written as history. Then Elenora spoke. "My father's not dead," she said. "He was taken. Morcrest lied. The king lied. And if we don't move now, Cerwyn will fall for good." The room shifted. A pause. A breath. Then one by one, the Flameborn placed their blades on the stone floor, tips pointed inward. A pact, old as kingdoms, older than crowns. One of them, a woman with a scar across her brow, stepped forward and handed Elenora a blade wrapped in linen. It was light, balanced, and etched with the same silver flame. "Your father carried this," she said. "Now it's yours." And just like that, the past came back, not as memory, but as fire. They left that same night. 10 riders. 1 falcon. A vow older than law. And behind them, deep in the earth, the flame burned again. But as they rode toward Cerwyn, another shadow moved ahead of them, a spy, cloaked in priest's robes, already galloping back to Morcrest's camp with word of Elenora's return. And in the dark halls of the Duke's stolen throne, the bells began to toll. The bells rang not as a warning, but as a taunt, slow, deliberate, and hollow as an empty promise made on a battlefield long after the fighting's done. They echoed down the valley like the voice of a dead king, heavy with the weight of stolen faith and blood yet to be spilled. From his tower balcony, Lord Harwin Morcrest stood tall and smug, wrapped in black wool trimmed with gold, watching the gates of Cerwyn tighten like the mouth of a liar caught too late. He knew she was coming. It wasn't fear that moved him, not exactly. Morcrest didn't fear anything with flesh and bone, not after the things he'd done in the quiet halls of other people's homes. But Elenora, she wasn't flesh anymore. She was legend now. And legends, once awakened, don't die easy. Behind the gates, the castle buzzed with unnatural calm, the kind of silence you find before a hurricane touches ground. The servants moved with downturned eyes and fast hands, soldiers marched with stiff backs, and the high chapel burned incense thick enough to choke a mule. Morcrest had tightened the keep like a fist, thinking control was the same as order. But Cerwyn had always belonged to the old blood, not the throne, not the crown, but the land, the stones, and the names whispered in its soil. Elenora rode beneath that sky like a storm that knew its purpose. She wore her father's blade on her hip, the silver flame now cleaned and sharp enough to split a lie down its middle. Her clothes were stitched with the gray of the Flameborn, but her eyes held something older than loyalty, the look of someone who'd seen good men burn and chose to come back anyway. Rhys rode beside her, silent as ever, one hand on his hilt, the other resting just above the wound that hadn't stopped bleeding since the skirmish at Windvale Ridge. The Flameborn followed close, hooves pounding in rhythm like war drums sent by the mountain gods. These were no young knights eager for glory. These were ghosts, men and women who had waited too long and lost too much to care about survival. They wanted justice, not victory. And Cerwyn was the altar they'd chosen to spill it on. But even as they approached the outer wall, Rhys leaned closer and whispered something that chilled her spine more than the autumn wind ever could. "They're not going to open the gate." Elenora looked up and saw it, the archers weren't aiming to scare, and the drawbridge hadn't moved an inch. They weren't planning to talk, negotiate, or warn. They meant to kill her. Rhys turned to the Flameborn, nodded once, and vanished into the trees like a wolf who knew the path no one else could follow. His task was older than the plan, an oath made years ago in another life: if ever Cerwyn falls into darkness, take the southern sewer by night and do what must be done. She didn't ask what must be done meant. She already knew. As the riders held their ground, she dismounted and walked forward alone, just her, the wind, and the falcon above circling like a final witness. She stopped within range of the archers, unstrapped her glove, and held her arm high. Ash-winged dove from the sky like a streak of iron lightning, landing with precision that stole the breath from every soldier watching. On his leg was tied another message, smaller this time, but folded in a style only one man ever used. Her father. The handwriting was shaky but clear. "The heart still beats. Find me in the thorns. Trust no one wearing gold. She read it 3 times before tucking it into her sleeve. The thorns. He had told her once, long ago, that beneath the rose garden there was a secret chamber used during the old rebellions, a place called the Thorn Vault, where traitors were kept and buried, where secrets were locked behind stone and shame. If he was alive, that's where he'd be. But getting there wouldn't be easy. Not with Morecrest standing watch and half the royal guard loyal to the gold he kept flowing through their hands like sacramental wine. Then, like a prayer answered by violence, the first explosion struck. It wasn't fire, not yet, just sound and dust, rising from the southern wall where Rhys had entered beneath the old sewer gate. It was a distraction, and it worked. The archers turned, the guards shouted, and Elenora moved, fast, low, trained like a creature born for the dirt and shadows of rebellion. She scaled the outer wall using a path known only to the servants, a trail of hidden stones her mother once used to sneak her into the stables before dawn. The past, it turned out, had a long memory. So did the land. Inside the keep, the world smelled of oil, sweat, and bad intentions. She moved fast, ducking beneath tapestries, slipping past drunken guards, heart pounding like a funeral drum. Every shadow held risk. Every sound threatened betrayal. And yet, she pushed forward, guided by instinct older than fear. At the garden wall, she found it. The rose bushes had withered, but the thorns remained, thick, angry, and sharp as broken promises. She sliced through them with her dagger, hand bleeding as she pulled away the dead vines to reveal a narrow door, hidden behind stone older than the kingdom itself. Inside, the thorn vault breathed dust and damp. She descended alone, torch flickering, flame dancing across carvings of battles no bard sang about anymore. And then, in the deepest room, chained but alive, she found him. Her father. Aged. Thin. Eyes sunken. But alive. Elenora, he whispered, barely believing. You weren't supposed to come. She dropped to her knees, voice cracking. Then you shouldn't have sent the bird. They embraced, the kind only people do when time has robbed them of all but the moment in their arms. It didn't fix anything. But it was enough. For now. Above, the fighting had begun in earnest. Steel clanged. Arrows screamed. The keep shook. And Morecrest, watching from his tower, finally realized what every tyrant learns too late, that bloodlines may bend, but they do not break. Especially not when fire and love walk hand in hand. There are moments in life, brief, brutal, and unmistakable, when time stops pretending it moves gently and instead comes down like judgment in iron boots. One of those moments struck when the door to the Thorn Vault exploded inward, and Elenora found herself face to face with the man who had once vowed, beneath Cerwyn's chapel, to protect her family, and then sold them to the crown for a title. General Malric didn't look like the devil from a painting. He didn't carry horns or claws or the red eyes of nightmares. He looked like an old soldier who'd seen too many winters, who wore his armor like skin and carried a sword that had cut more truth from the world than it ever did lies. And behind him, 24 soldiers, faces blank, swords ready, eyes uncertain. Not because they feared her, but because they had started to hear the rumors. The kind of rumors that carried truth on wings. Malric raised his blade with the weariness of a man who had spent his last years chasing ghosts, only to find one waiting in the flesh. Lady Elenora, he said, voice rough, low, and tired in the way only men who buried honor for duty ever get. Your father was a good man. She didn't move. She didn't blink. And you caged him beneath his own garden. He sighed, almost sadly, like a man who didn't expect to be forgiven but still wanted someone to understand before the end. I followed orders. The kind that come sealed in wax and soaked in fear. The crown feared your father's reach. They feared what Cerwyn meant to the people. And so you broke it? She asked, voice sharp as her drawn blade. No, Malric said. I buried it. There's a difference. Before he could speak again, Ashwing struck. The falcon came from the stairwell like vengeance in flight, beak bared, claws aimed straight for Malric's eyes. It was not meant to kill. It was meant to blind. To give her seconds. And seconds were all she needed. Elenora moved with the precision of a woman who had studied violence not as a sport, but as survival. She struck low, then high, then to the side, steel biting flesh just deep enough to draw truth from the man in charge of her family's ruin. The soldiers didn't move at first. They watched as Malric stumbled back, clutching his side, blood wetting his armor. But it wasn't fear that held them. It was doubt. And doubt is a dangerous thing in men trained to obey. Then came the call. A horn, distant but rising, the flame-born. From the north wall, through the servants' gate, and under the banners that hadn't flown since the king declared them outlaws, the old order returned. 10 riders. Grey cloaks. Silver flames. And at their head, sword now whole again and burning in the torchlight, came Sir Rhys. His face was pale. His breath labored. Blood stained his tunic at the ribs. But he rode like a man with nothing left to lose but his silence. He dismounted, walked straight into the vault, and met Malric's soldiers with the eyes of a man who had died once and come back unwilling to bow. "This ends now," he said, voice a steady thunder. The soldiers lowered their blades, not from command, but from memory. Some had fought beside Rhys in their younger years, back when oaths still meant something and men didn't sell honor for coin. Malric, kneeling now, chuckled through his pain. "You still believe you can win," he said, coughing. "Even now." Elenora looked to her father, who stood barely upright, but nodded once, a signal passed between blood and bond. "It's not about winning," she said softly. "It's about remembering who we were before you told us who we had to be." Then she knelt beside Malric and closed his eyes. He died without begging. Some men do. Up above, the castle had shifted. The guards had begun to disband. The servants wept, not in fear, but in relief. For the first time in years, Cerwyn's stones felt light again, like a weight had been lifted, even if blood had paid for it. They brought Elenora's father into the chapel and laid him in the sunlight, letting it touch his skin for the first time since his imprisonment. He spoke little, but held her hand, as if afraid to let go again now that the nightmare was finished. But it wasn't finished. Not yet. Lord Morecrest had not fled. He waited in the throne room, dressed in his wedding finery, the garments meant to wrap him in legitimacy. Gold thread. Crimson velvet. A crown forged in another man's fire. Elenora entered with Ashwing on her arm and the flameborn behind her. Morecrest smiled. "I see you brought the circus," he sneered. She said nothing. Words were done. What followed was not a duel. It was an ending. He charged with fury. She answered with grace. He screamed. She did not. When it was over, her blade was buried in his chest, and his crown rolled across the stone like a coin dropped in a church offering plate, small, worthless, and too late. That night, Cerwyn held its first vigil in years. No banners. No feast. Just quiet. Just truth. Her father passed 2 nights later, not from wound, but from peace. He died knowing his daughter had not only saved his name, but reclaimed a kingdom's soul. Elenora never took the crown. She left it on the altar, beside the ring Ashwing had brought home. The flameborn remained, not as rulers, but as watchers. And Rhys, well, Rhys stayed too. He didn't ask for her hand. He just took it one evening as they walked the northern wall, watching the falcon fly high above, cutting through the clouds like a memory that refused to fade. Ashwing never returned to the perch. He vanished into the wilds one morning, as falcons do when their duty's done. Some say he still circles Cerwyn. Some say he died in peace. But Elenora believed something else. She believed he flew north, to the mountains where freedom still breathed, carrying one final message on his leg. That the flame had not died. Only hidden. And now, at last, it burned again. Write in the comments where you're from, let's see how far these stories can spread. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new exciting stories. See you soon.